So we're incredibly fortunate this morning to have Minister Martin Foley with us to formally launch this edition. Martin has in the past been our Victorian Minister for Housing, and he continues to be the Minister for Mental Health, and it is in that capacity today that he joins us. Minister Foley's been a member of the Legislative Assembly for Albert Park since 2007, and since the election of the Andrews government, he's been Minister for Housing, Disability, Ageing, and then and now Minister for Mental Health, Equality and Creative Industries. Minister Foley, it's just wonderful to have you here with us today and to have the opportunity to hear from you, and so over to you.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and can I thank the Council for Homeless Persons for the outstanding and enduring leadership that you all show when it comes to housing and homelessness. And can I particularly thank Noel for his enduring work on Parity. And Parity is more than just a important journal for the council and for the issues of housing and homelessness, but it's that opportunity for advocacy and policy development that is shared widely across not just the non-government organisations, not just government, but equally people who've experienced homelessness. And for the purposes of today, the well and truly deep embedded relationship between homelessness, housing stress, and mental illness. I also begin by acknowledging that we meet here, we all virtually meet here somewhere on the lands of the First Peoples of this continent, and I'm particular, where I am, want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation, and particularly the Wurundjeri. And in doing so, just pause to reflect that it's our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are disproportionately overrepresented in both the measures of mental ill health and the issues of housing and homelessness. And there are many prospects to resolving that, but it's not for me to point to perhaps other than the statement from the heart and the work that this government is particularly doing on treaties, the First People Assemblies, and in the absence of any national leadership on that space, the important work that I'd like to think we can do as a community beyond Victoria, but certainly within Victoria. I've got a really nice set of notes from the department that's got a long list of all the contributions that we've made in the crossover between mental health and homelessness and housing, and touches on the NDIS. But I thought rather than read a very well written set of media release lines, that given the quality of the organisations are on this hookup and the limited time I've got, that perhaps what I might do is just reflect on some of the issues that you've touched on, Jenny, in those initial comments. And to do so through the prism of the fact that we are now understanding what the COVID normal reality that we are entering into. And at the moment in Victoria, with a small but concerning spike in the COVID infections, what that is teaching us about the fact that we are going to have to live with this different set of realities for some time. And those COVID realities are amplifying so many of the disadvantages and harms that our society had going into this crisis. Not only are they amplifying them, they are now adding new layers of complexity and different cohorts of our fellow citizens into those issues of housing and homelessness, and for the purposes of today, the issues around mental ill health. So if we had a mental health and all of its various intersections, particularly housing and homelessness, if we had a crisis in these areas in February this year, before the boom came down with COVID. The last 4 to 5 months have shown us that we are amplifying that crisis weekly. And with projections of substantial job losses, and we know that the implications that they have on homelessness and housing, and we know what the projections that we've seen in some quarters for what that means in mental ill health, we know that this issue is only going to get more significant for us. So what are the policy and programmatic responses that we need to do in order to not just do more of the same, but of course doing more of the same is in regards to what works is certainly very important, particularly when it comes to more provisions of housing support, when it comes to provisions of specialist and targeted support, and areas, whether it be through a gender lens, a Indigenous lens, a disability lens, a family violence lens. There are many points in which housing, homelessness and mental ill health come together. But what we do have is an opportunity through a number of tectonic plates shifting around the policy landscape at the moment. Jenny touched on one with the Victorian Royal Commission into Mental Health, and the other, from a number of other ones, would be the Productivity Commission's report due this week to be provided to the federal government. They have then some 25 federal parliamentary sitting days to table that. But equally, the fact that on the national cabinet structures, following some representations from Victoria and New South Wales, oddly enough, the fact that mental ill health and issues around responses to that and stimulus, economic stimulus, have managed to get in a structured way onto that national cabinet agenda. So I just want to briefly touch on those three areas in the short time and seek to not reassure, but point to paths of what I would hope to be constructive engagement between the housing and homelessness peaks and sectors, but more importantly, the myriad of groups and supporters of the council who are out there at the coalface of responding to consumers and families and clients in communities, in place, where housing, homelessness, economic disadvantage, poverty and mental ill health all come together in place and in people's lives. The Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system, as Jenny indicated, didn't in its interim report go into great lengths when it came to the issue of the links between housing and mental health. It is reflected in the terms of reference of the Commission. COVID also set them back, so we've pushed the date of the Royal Commission reporting back to the 5th of February. I am confident from the reports that they touched on in their interim report, but more importantly, the work that they've done since the interim report, that the Commission understands more deeply as its work has transpired, the rich intersections between the array of expressions of mental ill health and the range of other social policy issues, but particularly when it comes to the bedrock of which safe, affordable, secure housing provides. The issue of parity today certainly points to that in both lived experience and policy detail, and I'm sure that that will be welcomed by the Commission. But what we also need to understand is when it comes to the Commission's work is that it's how from housing and how from the overlay of mental ill health responses, it then needs to engage in a raft of other shift of services away from the clinical, away from the institutional tertiary levels, or indeed away from what we've successfully managed to achieve, instead of huge, great institutions on the hills that we may have had from from the last century, to be brutal about it, a whole series of mini institutions tucked away in the suburbs and the countryside, with much of the same culture. And it is only by securing people in communities with support, and the bedrock of that is housing, that the overall direction that clearly the Commission is heading in when it comes to shifting support and services into a more community-based service location, whilst also dealing with the issues around acute mental ill health, that housing will necessarily need to become a part of the equation. The fact that that same direction was reflected in the Productivity Commission's interim draft report, in October of last year, and their necessarily economic participation lens, which showed something like, for Victoria alone, $13 billion impact of what mental ill health does to the Victorian economy, and in the more than $70 billion worth of impact on the national economy every year. It is, from their work, a very sensible engagement to invest in different models of consumer-supported, integrated housing and mental health support. Having then linked that into a COVID emergency response, which saw, in a very strange way, a dual response out there in the mental health community, whereby frontline community triaging, phone-based, web-based services have taken off in the amount of demand that they have had to deal with, both from existing consumers and a whole new group of people who have come into the system. Yet at the same time, many community-based services and many clinical-based services saw a massive drop-off of people with mental ill health issues from their services, and in many regards, people disappeared from our systems, disappeared from supports. And in response to that, at the pushing of a couple of states, the National Cabinet has put together now a national pandemic mental health response plan, which touches on some of these issues, and that, with a bit more of push from the states in particular, we are confident we'll see in the National Recovery Strategy, through both the economic stimulus provisions around pushes for the prospect of particularly social and affordable housing being a key component of that, but to integrate that with the mental ill health responses together with the NDIS and a range of other well and truly cooked up policy proposals that lack the resources, the political coordination and the will to drive them through. It just strikes me that this sector of bringing together into an integrated manner through the prism of housing, person-centred, place-based, community-based solutions, of which, from a mental health perspective, there is now an unprecedented coming together of opportunities. Opportunity doesn't mean a guaranteed result, but if you've got the structures, if you've got the campaigning, and if you've got the organisational grunt to make sure that these moving pieces land in an appropriate way in the forthcoming months ahead, then I think that is an opportunity too important for not just the Council for the Homeless, not just states, not just the Commonwealth, but the entire Australian community, who are all touched by the issues of mental ill health, whereby 1 in 2 of us during the course of our lifetime will have a treatable mental illness, where 1 in 5 of us in any given year will have an episode of mental illness, and where somewhere around 3 to 4% of that group of Australians will, through their mental ill health, face a housing crisis. We are talking this issue touching every Australian in some direct lived experience manner. And it just now, we are on the cusp of opportunities, but opportunities don't turn into results without campaigning, without advocacy, without strong support. And in that regard, I know that the Council for Homeless and of course Parity as the voice of that organisation will be at the forefront of holding the political class's feet to the flame. And I look forward to that prospect, not just warming my toes, but landing in some outcomes of real, tangible policy reform, program delivery, and resource allocation. So I think the next few years, whilst going to be extraordinarily challenging, present unprecedented opportunity for the kind of work and leadership that the Council has so long advocated for and has so long managed to be at the forefront of change and innovation. And I look forward to that continuing to be the case as these real opportunities come together. So I might leave it at that, Jenny, given that I bang on too much, but there are exciting times, but really challenging times ahead of us all.
Many thanks, Minister, and thanks so much for speaking off the cuff, if you like. I think you just cheered us up, but I think you also made it pretty clear that, as usual, nothing will come easily and without a great deal more effort on all of our behalves. But I've often described you as the minister who gets what we do, and I think your comments today certainly are influencing our work plan for the next little while. So thank you so much for being here this morning and for formally launching this edition of Parity, and we look forward to continue to work with you to get those integrated outcomes to which you've alluded.